Hello friends, please like and subscribe to the channel and enjoy the stories. Chapter 1. The Train to Nowhere. It was the kind of evening that felt stolen from a painting. Soft strokes of orange and lavender smudged across the sky as the sun dipped below the horizon. The platform of the small countryside station was almost deserted, save for a few scattered passengers. Evelyn hugged her oversized coat tighter around her as the crisp air nipped at her cheeks. Her train was late, as usual, and the eerie quietness of the station only amplified her thoughts. She wasn't running away, not exactly. That would imply she had somewhere she was fleeing from or someone chasing her. But at 27, Evelyn had reached a point where life in the small town of Briarwood felt like being trapped in amber, still and suffocating. So, when the opportunity to leave for the city presented itself, she didn't think twice. The distant rumble of the train stirred her from her reverie. A few others on the platform began to stir, checking their watches or brushing invisible dust from their coats. Evelyn caught sight of a man not far from her. He looked oddly out of place, leaning against a lamppost, his silhouette sharp against the fading sky. His posture was casual, but there was an intensity in his gaze as he watched the tracks. The train screeched into the station, and the doors opened with a whoosh. Evelyn stepped inside, finding a seat by the window. To her surprise, the man from the platform slipped into the seat across from her, his piercing green eyes meeting hers for just a second before he casually looked out the window. The train jolted forward, and Evelyn felt an inexplicable urge to speak to him. She wasn't usually bold. Her friends often teased her for being shy, but something about this man pulled at her curiosity. "Headed somewhere far?" she asked, her voice tinged with the nervousness she couldn't quite hide. He turned to her, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Somewhere, yes. Far? That depends." Evelyn blinked, unsure how to respond. There was something enigmatic about him, as though he were guarding a secret. "I'm Evelyn," she offered, hoping to break the ice. "Julian," he replied, his voice smooth but distant. For the next hour, they exchanged pieces of their lives. Julian told her he was a writer, wandering from place to place in search of inspiration. Evelyn spoke about Briarwood, her dreams of finding something bigger, and her doubts about whether the city would offer the freedom she craved. "You don't strike me as someone who doubts," Julian said, his head tilted slightly as he studied her. Evelyn laughed softly. "You don't know me well enough to say that." He smiled, and for a moment, Evelyn felt like he could see right through her. As the train rattled on, Evelyn grew more at ease. Julian had a way of speaking that made her forget the passing time. He told stories about far-off places, an ancient library in Istanbul, a cafe in Paris that served poetry with its coffee, a hidden garden in Kyoto. Evelyn listened, entranced, picturing herself in those places. But something about Julian's stories felt off. They were too vivid, too perfect, and whenever Evelyn asked him about his past, he skillfully redirected the conversation. When the train reached its third stop, Evelyn realized they were the only ones left in the car. The silence between them felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. "Do you ever wonder," Julian said suddenly, "if some meetings are meant to happen?" Evelyn frowned, caught off guard by the question. "I think people like to believe that. It makes life feel less random." He leaned forward, his expression unusually serious. "And if it's not random, if some paths are meant to cross, no matter how improbable?" The train began to slow. Evelyn glanced out the window but saw nothing. No station, no lights, just an endless stretch of foggy fields. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice rising slightly. Julian stood, his movements calm and deliberate. "This is your stop." Evelyn's heart raced. "But I didn't. This isn't my station. I'm going to the city." He smiled, but it wasn't the warm, easy smile she had grown used to. It was bittersweet. "You were never going to the city, Evelyn." Before she could respond, the train doors slid open, revealing a landscape unlike anything she'd ever seen. The air shimmered, and the ground seemed to glow faintly as though lit from within. Strange, towering trees with silver leaves swayed gently in an invisible breeze. "What is this?" Evelyn whispered, stepping closer to the door but not daring to cross the threshold. Julian's gaze softened. "It's where you're meant to be. You don't remember yet, but you will." Panic surged through her. "What are you talking about? I don't understand." You've been stuck, Evelyn, in this in-between. It's time to move on. She shook her head, backing away. Move on to what? Julian's expression was filled with a sadness she couldn't comprehend. Goodbye, Evelyn. The doors closed and the train began to move again. Evelyn turned to the window, her heart pounding as she watched the strange, glowing world fade into the distance. When she looked back at Julian, he was gone. And in the seat where he had been, there was only a small notebook. Its leather cover was embossed with her name. Chapter 2. The Notebook. Evelyn stared at the leather-bound notebook lying on the seat. Her name glimmered faintly in the dim light of the train car, as if it had been etched just moments ago. The train rattled on, the rhythmic clatter of wheels against the tracks a sharp contrast to the turmoil in her mind. Julian was gone, not just moved to another car. He had vanished. No footsteps, no sound of a door opening, nothing. She touched the spot on the seat where he had been sitting, as if confirming he had been real. The warmth of his presence lingered faintly, but he was nowhere to be seen. Her pulse quickened as she reached for the notebook. Its weight in her hands was reassuring, solid, tangible. She turned it over, inspecting the smooth leather surface. The edges were frayed, the cover worn, as though it had been carried through countless journeys. Yet it felt strangely new, as if it had always belonged to her. The train car grew quieter, the hum of the engine fading to a low murmur. She opened the notebook. The first page was blank, except for a single line written in elegant handwriting she didn't recognize. The beginning is never where you think it is. A chill ran down her spine. The words felt like a whisper in her mind, a voice she couldn't quite place. She flipped to the next page, expecting more cryptic messages, but instead, she found a sketch. It was a drawing of the glowing forest she had seen outside the train. The silver-leaf trees were captured with meticulous detail, each line sharp and precise. But what caught her attention was the figure in the center of the drawing. A woman standing at the edge of the forest, her back to the viewer. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. The woman was wearing the exact coat she had on now. This isn't real, she murmured to herself, slamming the notebook shut, but it was real. Every sound, every touch, every detail of the notebook in her hands grounded her in a reality she couldn't explain. The train jerked suddenly, and Evelyn gripped the armrest to steady herself. Outside the window, the fog had thickened, swallowing the landscape. She could barely see the faint outlines of trees and hills. A soft hum filled the air, not the mechanical hum of the train, but something deeper, resonating in her chest like a song she didn't know she had forgotten. The notebook fell open in her lap. This time, the page wasn't blank. You're almost there. Remember why you came. Remember? She whispered, her voice trembling. The words felt heavy with meaning, but they didn't make sense. She didn't understand. Before she could dwell on it further, the train screeched to a halt, the sound jarring and unnatural. The lights in the car flickered, and for a moment, Evelyn was plunged into darkness. When the lights came back on, the door at the far end of the car slid open. A figure stepped inside, a man in a conductor's uniform. His face was partially obscured by shadows, but his presence filled the space like a storm cloud. He wasn't the friendly, unassuming conductor who had checked her ticket earlier. This man carried an air of authority, his every step deliberate and echoing. "Miss Evelyn," he said, his voice deep and commanding. She froze. "How do you know my name?" The conductor gestured to the notebook in her hands. "It's written there, isn't it?" Evelyn clutched the notebook tighter, her knuckles turning white. "What's going on? Where am I?" "You're on the train," he said simply, as if that explained everything. "But the question you should be asking is, where are you going?" "I was going to the city," she snapped, her frustration overriding her fear. "But this isn't normal." The train stopped in the middle of nowhere, and there was this forest. And Julian. The conductor's expression darkened at the mention of Julian. "You spoke to him?" "Yes," she said hesitantly. "Do you know him?" He stepped closer, his polished boots clicking against the floor. "Julian is a guide, but he doesn't belong here, just as you don't." "What does that mean?" "It means," the conductor said, his voice softening just slightly, "you have a choice to make. That notebook is not just a keepsake. It holds your story. And where this train takes you depends on what you choose to write." Evelyn opened the notebook again, her hands trembling. This time, the blank pages seemed to stretch endlessly, as though they were waiting for her to fill them. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What am I supposed to write?" "That," the conductor said, "is for you to decide. But you must choose carefully. Every word carries weight, and once written, it cannot be undone." Evelyn's mind raced. Her story? Was this some kind of metaphor, or was he being literal? And if it was true, what could she possibly write? "Why me?" she asked, desperate for answers. The conductor tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Because it's your story, Evelyn. No one else can write it for you." The train jolted again, and the fog outside began to clear. But what it revealed was not the familiar countryside or the bustling city she had expected. It was something entirely different, a shimmering expanse of light and shadow, shifting and alive. "You're almost there," the conductor said, "but you need to decide where there is." Evelyn looked down at the notebook, her heart pounding. She didn't know what lay ahead, but one thing was clear. The pages would lead her. With trembling hands, she picked up the pen tucked into the spine of the notebook and pressed it to the paper. Chapter 3. The First Word. Evelyn stared at the pen in her hand, its silver tip poised over the blank page of the notebook. The air in the train car felt heavier, as if the moment itself were holding its breath. The conductor stood still, watching her, his dark eyes unreadable. Beyond the window, the shimmering expanse outside seemed to pulse, as though alive and waiting. "What happens if I don't write?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The conductor tilted his head, his expression softening. "Then the train keeps moving, and your destination will be decided for you, but you may not like where it takes you." Evelyn's chest tightened. The thought of surrendering control terrified her, but so did the responsibility of choosing. She looked down at the notebook again, her reflection faintly visible in the glossy ink of the blank page. "What if I write the wrong thing?" she asked. "There is no wrong," the conductor said, "but there is no going back, either." Evelyn's fingers trembled as she pressed the pen to the paper. The ink flowed effortlessly, forming the first word that came to her mind. Home. The moment she wrote it, the train jolted violently, throwing her back against the seat. The lights flickered, and the world outside the window seemed to ripple like water disturbed by a stone. The conductor grabbed hold of a nearby railing, his expression calm but watchful. Evelyn clutched the notebook tightly as the train began to speed up, the wheels screeching against the tracks. The shimmering expanse outside started to shift, colors bleeding into one another until they resolved into something familiar. The fog cleared, revealing a quiet street lined with houses. The paint on the fences was chipped, and the trees were bare, their skeletal branches reaching toward a gray sky. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She knew this place. It was Briarwood, but something was wrong. The town looked older, more worn. The houses seemed smaller, their colors faded, and there was no one in sight, no children playing in yards, no cars rumbling down the road. It was as if the town had been abandoned. The train screeched to a halt, and the conductor gestured toward the door. "This is where you must go." Evelyn hesitated, clutching the notebook. "Why does it look like this? This isn't how I remember it." "It's not the Briarwood you left," the conductor said. "It's the Briarwood you carry within you." "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice rising. "Why is it so empty?" He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped aside, allowing her a clear path to the door. Evelyn stood, her legs unsteady. The notebook felt heavier in her hands now, as if the word she had written carried its own weight. Slowly, she stepped off the train. The air outside was colder than she expected, biting against her skin. The train's doors slid shut behind her, and when she turned to look, it was gone, leaving only an empty track stretching into the distance. She turned back toward the street. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft crunch of her boots against the gravel as she walked. The closer she got to the houses, the more details she noticed. Curtains drawn tightly over windows, mailboxes stuffed with yellowed letters, toys abandoned in overgrown yards. Evelyn's chest tightened. This wasn't the Briarwood she had left behind. It was a ghost of the town, a version that had been hollowed out. She stopped in front of a house she recognized instantly. Her house. The porch swing swayed gently in the breeze, its rusty chains creaking. The paint on the front door was peeling, and the flower beds were overrun with weeds. But it was unmistakably hers. She climbed the steps, her heart pounding. The doorknob felt cold under her hand as she turned it. The door swung open with a groan, revealing a dimly lit interior. "Hello?" she called, her voice echoing. No answer. She stepped inside, the wooden floorboards creaking under her weight. The living room was exactly as she remembered it, down to the faded rug and the crooked picture frame on the wall. But there was something uncanny about the stillness, as if the house itself were holding its breath. On the coffee table lay another notebook, identical to the one she held. She approached it cautiously, her footsteps soft against the floor. When she opened it, her breath caught. The pages were filled with writing, but not hers. The handwriting was delicate, looping, and familiar. She flipped through, her heart racing as she read fragments of the entries. She doesn't see me. She doesn't remember. I tried to tell her, but she wasn't ready. Maybe next time she'll understand. Evelyn's hands shook. She turned to the last page and found a single line scrawled hastily across it. "You were always meant to come back. Now do you see?" Before she could process the words, she heard it, a soft knock at the door. Her head snapped up, her heart hammering in her chest. She turned toward the sound, the notebook clutched tightly in her hands. The knock came again, louder this time. Swallowing her fear, Evelyn moved toward the door. Her hand hovered over the knob for a moment before she mustered the courage to open it. Standing on the porch was Julian, but he was different. His face was paler, his eyes darker, and his presence felt heavier, like a shadow stretching over the threshold. "You rode home," he said, his voice quieter than before. "But did you mean it?" Evelyn's throat went dry. "I don't know what I meant." Julian stepped closer, his gaze piercing. "Then it's time to decide, Evelyn. See, this place, this version of Briarwood, exists because of you, but it can't hold you forever. Either you stay and make it whole, or you leave and let it fade." Her grip on the notebook tightened. "Why does it depend on me?" "Because it's your story," he said simply, "and every story needs an ending." Evelyn looked past him, her eyes scanning the empty street. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a faint melody she almost recognized. She turned back to Julian, her heart aching with uncertainty. "What if I choose wrong?" Julian's expression softened. "There's no wrong choice, only the one you can live with." Evelyn glanced down at the notebook in her hands. Slowly she flipped to a blank page and raised the pen. Her story wasn't over. Not yet. Chapter 4. The Choice. Evelyn's hand trembled as she hovered the pen over the blank page. The weight of Julian's words pressed down on her, heavier than the silence of the empty street outside. Every story needs an ending, he had said. But how could she choose an ending for a story she didn't fully understand? "Stay and make it whole," Julian had said, "or leave and let it fade." Her gaze darted back to him. He stood on the threshold, his presence like a dark thread binding her to this strange version of Briarwood. His green eyes were softer now, no longer holding the sharp edge of mystery. Instead, they seemed tired, as though he had been waiting for her to reach this moment far longer than she realized. "What happens to this place if I leave?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Julian stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The air shifted, growing heavier, as though the house itself exhaled at his presence. He crossed the room and stood by the window, looking out at the empty street. "It fades," he said simply. "Slowly at first. The colors will drain, the shapes will blur. Eventually, it will be nothing but fragments, scattered pieces of a memory that no longer has a home." Evelyn clutched the notebook to her chest. "And if I stay?" Julian turned to face her. "Then you rebuild it, piece by piece, word by word. You bring the people back, give them voices, stories, lives. You give this place a future." Her breath caught. "You make it sound like I'm writing a book, not living my life." Julian smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "What's the difference?" Evelyn's thoughts churned. Could she stay in this empty, haunting version of Briarwood and rebuild it, knowing she might never leave? Or could she walk away, let it dissolve, and face whatever unknown lay beyond? She glanced at the notebook again. The page beneath her pen seemed to pulse faintly, as if urging her to write. She pressed the tip of the pen down, letting it flow instinctively, without thought. Stay. The moment the word formed, the house shuddered. The air grew warmer, richer, as though life itself was stirring. The gray light filtering through the windows softened, and faint colors began to seep into the room. The deep brown of the wooden floor, the warm amber of the faded rug. Evelyn dropped the pen, startled. "What's happening?" Julian stepped forward, his gaze fixed on her. "You've chosen to stay. The story begins again." As if in answer to his words, a sound echoed from the street outside, the distant hum of voices. Evelyn rushed to the window, her heart pounding. Outside, the empty street was no longer empty. Figures began to appear, faint at first, like shadows coalescing into solid form. A child dashed past on a bicycle, his laughter ringing out as he sped down the street. A woman emerged from a nearby house, carrying a basket of laundry. Across the road, a man stood on a ladder, painting the trim of his porch. Evelyn's chest tightened. These weren't strangers. They were people she knew. Mrs. Abernathy, the old woman who used to bake cookies for the neighborhood children. Jonah, the boy who had once built a treehouse in his backyard. Even Mr. Carter, the grumpy mailman who always forgot her name. "They're coming back," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Julian nodded. "They were always here, waiting for you. This place is a reflection of you, Evelyn. It can't exist without you." Her gaze turned to him, searching his face for answers. "But why me? Why am I the one who has to stay?" Julian hesitated, his expression unreadable. "Because you've been here before." Her blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" He gestured to the notebook. "Look inside." Evelyn hesitated before flipping to the first page. The elegant handwriting she had seen before was gone. In its place was her own, messy and uneven. Page after page was filled with entries she didn't remember writing. Descriptions of Briarwood, memories of her childhood, and dreams of a life she'd longed for but never lived. This can't be mine," she said, shaking her head. "It is," Julian said softly. "You've been here many times before, Evelyn. Each time you chose to stay and rebuild. Each time you tried to make this place whole, but you never finished." The words hit her like a blow. "Why not?" "Because you always remembered," Julian said. "You remembered the life you left behind, and it pulled you back. But this time," he stepped closer, his voice lowering, "this time you need to see it through." Evelyn's hands shook as she closed the notebook. "And what about you? Where do you fit into all of this?" Julian's expression softened. "I'm here to guide you, to remind you of what you've forgotten and help you find your way back." "But who are you?" she pressed. He hesitated, and for the first time she saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. "Someone who made his choice a long time ago, and someone who hopes you'll make a different one." Before she could ask what he meant, the sound of the door opening behind her made her whirl around. A little girl stood in the doorway, her dark hair falling in messy waves over her shoulders. She couldn't have been more than 8, and yet there was something familiar about her, a brightness in her eyes, a quiet determination in the way she held herself. "Who are you?" Evelyn asked, her voice trembling. The girl smiled. "You don't remember me yet, but you will." She stepped inside, her small hand reaching for Evelyn's. The touch sent a jolt through her, and suddenly, fragments of memories flashed in her mind. Running through the fields, climbing trees, a swing set under the oak in her backyard. The girl was her. A younger version of herself, the part she had lost along the way. The girl looked up at her, her smile unwavering. "It's time to finish the story." Evelyn's grip on the notebook tightened, and for the first time she felt a spark of clarity. She didn't know where this journey would take her, but she knew one thing. She wasn't alone. And this time, she wouldn't leave the story unfinished. Chapter 5. The Thread of Memory. Evelyn sat on the floor of the living room, the notebook open in front of her. The little girl, her younger self, was perched on the faded rug nearby, humming softly as she played with a strand of her dark hair. Julian leaned against the doorway, his watchful presence steady but quiet. The room felt alive now. The air no longer carried the oppressive stillness it had when she first arrived. Light poured through the windows, casting warm, golden patches across the floor. Outside, the hum of Briarwood returning to life grew louder. Distant laughter, the chirping of birds, the low murmur of conversation. But Evelyn couldn't focus on any of it. Her eyes were fixed on the notebook, its pages brimming with words she didn't remember writing. "How is this possible?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How could I have written all of this and not remember?" The little girl looked up, her eyes twinkling with a knowing mischief. "Because you forgot," she said simply. Evelyn frowned. "Forgot what?" The girl didn't answer. Instead, she reached out and tugged at the sleeve of Evelyn's sweater, pointing to a specific entry in the notebook. The handwriting was her own, shaky and uneven, as though it had been scrawled in a rush. "I have to let go. If I don't, it'll keep happening. Over and over again." Evelyn's stomach tightened. She looked at Julian. "What does this mean?" Julian stepped forward, his expression serious. "It means that the life you left behind still holds you, and as long as it does, this place, the version of Briarwood you've created, will remain incomplete." She shook her head. "I don't understand. What am I holding on to?" He sighed, his gaze softening. "Memories, regrets, people you lost, moments you couldn't change. They're all threads tying you to a past you can't let go of. And until you cut those threads, you'll keep coming back here, trying to fix something that can't be fixed." Evelyn's throat tightened. The words felt like a knife twisting in her chest. "But how do I let go?" Julian knelt beside her, his voice gentle. "You start by remembering. All of it. Even the things that hurt." The little girl smiled and clapped her hands, as though this were the simplest thing in the world. "It's not scary," she said. "You've already lived it once. You can do it again." Evelyn hesitated, her gaze shifting back to the notebook. The words on the page seemed to blur, rearranging themselves into something new. A single word appeared in bold, inked letters. "Begin." She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and pressed her fingers against the page. The moment she touched it, the world around her shifted. She was no longer in the living room. Instead, she stood in a sunlit park, the scent of wildflowers thick in the air. Children's laughter rang out nearby, and the distant rumble of traffic hummed softly in the background. Evelyn turned, her heart racing. She knew this place. It was Briarwood Park, the one she had visited every Saturday with her family. A voice called out, startling her. "Evelyn, over here!" She turned and saw her mother waving from a picnic blanket, her face alight with joy. Her father sat beside her, a book in his lap, and little Evelyn was running toward them, her hair flying behind her. Evelyn's chest tightened. She hadn't seen her parents in years, not like this, not so alive and full of laughter. "You can join them if you want," Julian's voice said behind her. She turned to find him standing a few feet away, his hands in his pockets. "This is a memory," he continued, "but it's also a choice. You can step into it, relive it, and let it go, or you can hold on to it and let it hold on to you." Evelyn looked back at the scene, her younger self now tugging on her father's arm, urging him to play. The sight made her heart ache with longing. "I don't know if I can," she admitted, her voice breaking. "What if I lose them all over again?" Julian stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You won't lose them. They'll always be a part of you. But holding on to the pain of losing them, it's what keeps you stuck here. It's what keeps Briarwood incomplete." Tears streamed down her face as she watched the scene unfold. Her mother's laugh, her father's smile, her own childish exuberance. It was all so vivid, so real. Slowly, she stepped forward, her feet moving of their own accord. She knelt beside her mother, who turned to her with a warm smile. "Evelyn," her mother said, her voice soft and full of love. "You've grown up so much." Evelyn's breath caught. "You know who I am?" Her mother reached out, cupping her cheek. "We've always known. But you've been carrying us for too long, sweetheart. It's time to let us rest." Her father leaned over, his voice kind. "We're proud of you, Evie. But you don't need to stay here anymore. You've done enough." Little Evelyn looked up from where she was playing and smiled. "It's okay," she said. "You'll be okay." Evelyn broke down, sobbing as she clung to her mother. The warmth of the embrace filled her with a bittersweet ache, and for the first time in years she felt truly seen, truly loved. When she finally pulled away, the scene around her began to blur, fading into golden light. Her parents and younger self smiled at her one last time before disappearing, leaving her standing alone in the park. Evelyn opened her eyes and found herself back in the living room. The notebook lay closed on the floor, and the little girl, her younger self, was gone. Julian stood nearby, watching her with quiet understanding. "You did it," he said. Evelyn wiped her tears, her heart feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. Is it over? Julian shook his head. Not yet, but you've taken the first step. The rest is up to you. She looked out the window. The town of Briarwood was alive now, fully alive. People walked the streets, laughter filled the air, and sunlight bathed the houses in warmth. Evelyn picked up the notebook, a sense of determination settling over her. This was her story, and for the first time she felt ready to finish it. Where do I start? She asked. Julian smiled. Where all stories do, at the beginning. Final chapter. The end and the beginning. The notebook felt heavy in Evelyn's hands, though she knew its weight was not physical. It carried the burden of her memories, her choices, and the life she had to rebuild. Briarwood was alive now, bustling with activity outside her window. Yet she still felt a strange stillness within her, as though one last thread remained uncut. Julian stood near the door, his gaze fixed on her. The warmth in his green eyes was now tinged with something deeper, anticipation, perhaps, or quiet sorrow. This is where you decide, he said softly. Evelyn turned to him, her fingers brushing over the notebook's leather cover. Haven't I already made my choice? I stayed. I remembered. I let go. Julian nodded. You've done all of that, but there's one question left unanswered. Her brow furrowed. What question? Julian stepped closer, his voice lowering. What do you want, Evelyn? Not for Briarwood. Not for the people you've brought back, but for yourself. What do you want your story to be? The words struck her like a thunderclap. What did she want? For so long she had been consumed by the past, by the ache of loss and the weight of regret. But now that she had faced those ghosts, the future lay open before her, a blank page waiting to be filled. I don't know, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Julian smiled gently. Then maybe it's time to find out. Evelyn found herself walking through the streets of Briarwood. The town had come alive in ways she could never have imagined. Children laughed and played, shopkeepers chatted with customers, and the scent of freshly baked bread wafted from the bakery. It was familiar, yet new. A version of Briarwood that felt like a dream she had finally brought into focus. As she walked, people waved to her, their faces bright with recognition. She saw Mrs. Abernathy arranging flowers on her porch, Jonah climbing the old oak tree in his backyard, and Mr. Carter grumbling good-naturedly as he delivered mail. But something felt different. For all the life and color that surrounded her, Evelyn couldn't shake the sense that she was still on the outside, looking in. Her steps led her to the edge of town, where a narrow dirt path wound through the woods. She hesitated for a moment before following it, the sound of leaves crunching beneath her feet. At the end of the path stood a small, weathered cottage. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the faint scent of lavender lingered in the air. Julian was waiting for her on the porch. You've been busy, he said, his voice warm. Evelyn nodded. It's beautiful, isn't it? Everything feels right. He tilted his head, studying her. And yet, you're not satisfied. She looked away, her gaze drifting to the forest beyond. I thought staying would be enough, that bringing this place back to life would make me whole, but it hasn't. Not completely. Julian stepped down from the porch, standing in front of her. That's because Briarwood isn't your ending, Evelyn. It never was. It's a place for beginnings, for starting over. But it's not where your story ends. Her heart ached at his words. Then what happens now? Do I leave? Do I lose all of this again? Julian smiled, a flicker of sadness in his eyes. You don't lose it. You carry it with you. Wherever you go, this place will be a part of you, just as you are a part of it. But to move forward, you have to take the next step. Evelyn looked down at the notebook in her hands. The final page was blank, waiting for her to write the ending. What happens to you? She asked, her voice trembling. Julian hesitated before answering. I'm tied to this place, Evelyn. As long as it exists, so do I. But if you move on, I fade. Her breath caught. No, that's not fair. You've helped me so much. I can't just leave you behind. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. You won't be leaving me behind. You'll be setting me free. This isn't my story, it's yours. It always has been. Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at him. For all the mystery that surrounded Julian, for all the questions she still had, she knew one thing with certainty. He had been her anchor, her guide, and her friend. She opened the notebook to the final page and raised the pen. Her hand shook as she wrote the words, each one carrying the weight of her decision. The end of one story is the beginning of another. The moment she finished, the world around her began to shift. The colors of Briarwood grew brighter, almost blinding, before fading into a soft golden glow. She felt herself being lifted, weightless, as though she were floating through a dream. Julian's voice was the last thing she heard. "Goodbye, Evelyn, and thank you for finishing the story." Evelyn woke to the sound of birdsong. She was lying in a meadow, the sun warm on her face. The notebook was gone, replaced by a blank journal resting in her lap. She sat up, her heart pounding. The meadow stretched out before her, vibrant and alive, and in the distance she saw a small village she didn't recognize. A figure appeared on the horizon, walking toward her. It wasn't Julian, but someone new, a young woman with a kind smile and a familiar glint of mischief in her eyes. "Are you lost?" the woman asked. Evelyn shook her head, a smile spreading across her face. "No, I think I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." She opened the journal, the blank pages inviting her to begin again. This time, the story was hers to write.